Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-futurism.
Welcome back, listeners. You are, as always, receiving our broadcast from the King Charles III space station. I'm Tomo.
I'm Callum Drysdale, and you, our listeners, are letting the country down.
Specifically, you are not having enough babies.
We know the country has been dealt a bad hand in this regard, what with its two most handsome male podcasters busy in space rather than doing their duty on Earth.
A falling birth rate is very bad news for any country, especially those whose politics amount to a boomocratic Ponzi scheme. But, as today's interviewee will tell us, we can put things right with one weird trick.
That interviewee is Aria Babu. Aria is a researcher who, as of the past couple of years, has begun to turn her brilliant mind towards birth rates.
So persuasive is Aria on this topic that Callum and I have already made the KC3 more baby-friendly than ever before. Infant visitors will note the installation not only of stair gates at the airlock, but also warm milk on draft at the bar.
Aria, welcome to the King Charles III space station.
Hi, guys.
Aria, what is pronatalism and what got you into it?
So pronatalism is the politics of thinking that we should have more children, as opposed to the politics of just assuming that fertility decline happens and we're happy about this and maybe this is better for women, or even the politics of David Attenborough, who thinks that in order to save the planet, we need fewer kids. And I first got interested in it basically because I was at the pub talking to some friends and I basically parroted the David Attenborough line. And they were like, actually, here are some reasons why more people is actually better. In fact, as we've gotten richer, we've mostly gotten richer because we've had more people able to work, able to contribute to the economy. In fact, having like this big globalized economy requires having lots of people who are incredibly specialized, working on a whole bunch of different things. In order to maintain the current level of knowledge that we have, we probably need like a really substantial proportion of the population working on like research and thinking about things. And in terms of resources, the countries that are getting richest are actually also like not increasing their CO2 emissions nearly as fast as countries that are like much, much poorer. And similarly, we also like have been able to feed the current population much more easily. So like fewer people in absolute numbers starve to death now, even though the population is much higher than it has basically ever historically been. So we probably don't need to worry about resources in the way that like Malthusian environmentalists think we do.
And of course, more children are just nice, right? People want to have more children.
People want to have more children. And also like I quite like being alive. And I think probably lots of people who would have lives like me would also like to be alive. And therefore, like the fact that the British population is like shrinking and people are like basically like disappearing, I think that's actually quite sad.
We at this podcast are uniquely interested in the United Kingdom. And let's talk about the United Kingdom's birth rate. The most recent statistics I think I've got here from the ONS put us at 1.49 children per woman. So what does this number mean? What does 1.49 mean for us as a country going forward? And like, what does that figure actually represent?
So it basically means that every generation we should expect to see the population shrink. So we need 2.1 children about per woman in order to maintain a stable population. 2.1 because you need to replace yourself, and also like some people just don't always make it to adulthood. 1.49 probably means what? That the population shrinks by a quarter each generation. This is actually reasonably good as a birth rate, or reasonably healthy as a birth rate for a rich country.
Because other wealthy countries are doing far, far worse.
Other wealthy countries are doing far worse. Basically, Protestant Northern Europe and America has a reasonably high birth rate for how wealthy it is. Then like Catholic Europe and East Asia then do worse.
Well, there are some horrific statistics coming out of South Korea, right?
Yeah, so South Korea is the worst global performer. But like Japan's also not doing great. Italy's not doing great. Spain's not doing great.
And what does it mean for those countries in the long term if they're not doing great?
So with South Korea's birth rate of 0.7, this means that for every 100 current South Koreans, they should expect to have, I think, about 4 great-grandchildren.
Which is, I mean, that's an existential question.
Yeah, it means that South Korea will be over unless something changes. Japan's birth rate is currently about 1.3, which means that twice the number of great-grandchildren, but it's still only 8 great-grandchildren. Italy, because it's also already quite old, is losing about 300,000 people a year.
What does it mean if the population is getting smaller? I'd have thought there are a number of benefits from this, right? There's more houses to go round. There's less of a need for as much food, as much power. Some might argue, as you said, the David Attenborough line, that actually this is a good thing.
So there are some benefits. I actually think the most compelling benefit is that crime goes down the older your population is. Crime is basically only done by young men. So when you have fewer young men, you have safer streets.
You see that, Tom? The streets will be much safer when we hit middle age.
Send all the young men into space.
In space, no one can hear you mug anyone.
But I think in terms of the economy, so I think Malthus basically was writing at the last moment at which it was true, where that by shrinking the population, that people would be better off.
Do you want to just tell people who Malthus is?
Yeah, so Malthus is, he was, I think, a Victorian economist. I think he was British, and he was writing basically to say that we shouldn't send any aid to Ireland during the famine because Irish people were too profligate, they were having too many children, and that we needed to let them naturally die off so that their population could shrink and that they could share their resources in a way that worked for them. I think Malthus was writing basically at the point in the world where the Industrial Revolution had made it no longer true that in order to live a better life, it would be better to shrink the population. At that point, we'd started to have major innovations in farming technology, in factory makings. That meant that actually more people, more workers, more innovative brains meant that we'd have more resources. I think people have a pretty poor intuitions about this because the average person maybe is actually consuming more resources than they're contributing. We run a deficit. So you can kind of intuitively think that. But we do have people who are long tail distributed. So if 1 in 100 babies manages to make farming twice as more efficient, you can actually make people much better off by having those extra 100 babies.
But these ideas haven't actually died out. I mean, Paul Ehrlich's book impacted and influenced a huge number of particularly what we called the weird, nerdy people on particularly US campuses, right, into not having children because climate change would end the world. So these ideas are still around, aren't they? They're
still around. And I think it's based on the same intuition. You can basically make the same long-tail distributed argument that I made about food resources for environmental innovations. I suspect, the actual traditional person does just they drive their car, they eat food. They are obviously creating emissions. But I expect actually almost all of our carbon reduction is not going to come from population reduction. It's going to come from inventing new green energy. It's going to come from inventing new efficient ways of living our lives. And that stuff is going to come from more people, especially the kinds of people who are born to people who care about the environment.
And these are young people, right? And this is the problem that as we get older, there might be less crime and things might be calmer. But we're going to lose out a lot of innovative people, on dynamic people, and the sort of dynamism that comes with a larger population and a young population.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we have falling population numbers, that means inevitably that the distribution of that population starts falling towards the older cohort. And that has some bad consequences as well, doesn't it? As we're seeing in this country.
Not bad consequences if you are an older person.
If you are an older person of that particular generation.
Yeah.
But the problem is that young people are going to be the ones who are paying the social care bills and all that kind of thing.
But because you have more older people per worker, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think by being basically the largest voting cohort, boomers have managed to get everything they want out of a democracy. Cheap university, basically free university, low taxes when they're working, very, very generous pensions when they're old. Unless we have way more young people, this is obviously we're just going to keep voting for this.
Well, and it's a one-way ratchet as well, because the fewer young people there are to vote for young people's interests.
Yeah.
And this will continue until...
Well, and also, if young people are the ones having children, right? That if you have fewer young people who are, having disadvantaged conditions, they're not going to feel like they want to have children. And that inverted pyramid of a demographic chart just continues all the way down to zero.
Exactly. Right now, the boomers are preventing us from building. We're having fewer children. And so the boomers become more powerful with every decade.
Yeah. Are there populations that are bucking this trend? So because I imagine if you have nations that are having ever fewer children, the populations that basically are able to continue having children, they will see their share of the national population grow.
Yeah, so I think there are two groups you can point to, basically. The Amish and
the Shaggers.
and the Orthodox Jews, who, to be fair, both of them probably are having lots of sex. If you're not allowed to play on your phone or watch TV, then what else are you going to do?
It's a compelling argument.
Good job we have Wi-Fi signal up here in the King Charles.
Well, otherwise, Tom, who knows what you and I would get up to.
But yeah, I think they're both groups. They were modern innovations for their time when they first appeared, they're not like super traditional expressions of their religions. Like the Amish are a kind of Protestant, and the modern Orthodox Judaism is its own kind of Victorian innovation as well. But what they've done is they've completely like cut themselves off and like frozen their cultures in aspect, like from what they were like when they were first created. Usually they don't participate in modern economies. They'd have like very, very hyper traditional gender roles. And I think what's interesting is both of these cultures are also quite good at keeping their members. So the Mormons have started to experience falling birth rates because Mormons now have quite a high rate of deconversion, and the deconversion is like concentrated in men as well. So lots of their like young Mormon women are not getting married. Amish and Orthodox Jews are also quite good at holding on to their members, as well as like getting them to like live these isolated lives.
Well, I mean, what they've basically done is whatever it is in modern society that is stopping the birth rates, they've been able to stop that getting in, right?
Yeah. And also, I think noteworthily, they both benefit from modern technologies that make it easier to have kids as well. So the Amish and Orthodox Jews do just participate in modern healthcare. So when the baby boom happened, I think you can largely attribute lots of things about the baby boom to being cheaper housing and a decrease in maternal mortality. The Amish, like, they use antibiotics. They got rid of sepsis. They experienced modern healthcare, basically. And their birth rates also track the business cycle as well. So like when the financial crisis happened, Amish birth rates also fell along like regular American along with the same like kind of lines that like American regular birth rates.
But just at a much higher level.
But from a much higher base, yeah.
So what does this look like? If they are, I mean, do you know what their TFRs are?
It's a little bit difficult to tell with the Amish because they are just like, they're on records as like normal Americans, but you can kind of look at it based on like what proportion of people say that they speak Pennsylvania Dutch as their first language. So you're expecting like a birth rate that's between 5 and 7, depending on what kind of Amish they are. So there are like less strict Amish people as well.
And going off those numbers, what you said about the South Koreans, in 100 years, do you know what kind of like what proportion of the US could then feasibly be Amish?
I can't do the arithmetic on the fly right now, but I think I remember working it out to be like about the year 2200, you would expect the Amish to be the majority. And the only reason it takes that long is because the Orthodox Jews are like butting up against them and are almost as high.
And who would be the most powerful country in the world according to those trends at that point?
I guess America and Israel.
Because America and Israel are keeping up their birth rates, unlike everyone else,
Yes.
even the developing world.
So in the developing world, there are countries with higher birth rates. So Nigeria would be the country, I think, that's on record with having the highest birth rate. Although lots of people think that Nigerian numbers are overrated because there are personal reasons for families to inflate the number of children they have because it means they can claim more benefits. And there's a reason for like the Nigerian government to turn a blind eye to this because it means they can get more aid. But Nigeria claims, I think, to have a birth rate of over 5.
But these are falling, right? They're displaying
falling.
a lot of these developing nations, even though they're again starting from the high levels, they're following the same like S-curve pattern of the developed world that like death rates fall and then birth rates track like a generation later, right?
Yeah, basically. Like I would hope Nigeria gets rich and I would expect its birth rate to fall in line with that. Maybe not. I wouldn't be surprised if there are some African countries that also have populations that are like the Amish or like the Orthodox Jewish people who like have like interesting like prenatal cultures that do shield them from the overall trend, but they're not like a high enough proportion of their own countries for us to see that yet.
So it seems that some of these cultures that we've mentioned have intuited that if you bring more children into the world than other cultures, that's the best way for your values to persist. And it's sometimes said that demography is destiny. Is that fair to say on a national level, those countries that have the biggest populations will be the most powerful in the long term?
I actually don't think that's the case in either the Amish or the Orthodox Jewish situations. For example, neither of them like particularly economically productive, and they're both pacifists as well, basically. So like the Orthodox Jews don't get conscripted by the Israeli army. So in terms of like actual like national power, it's difficult to know whether they would actually even be capable of contributing to like either the American like overall like global power or like the Israeli state's overall power.
Well, it's a problem that Israel has, right? Because a growing proportion of its population is Hasidic, is Haredi,
Yeah.
right? So they're not you can't draft them, you can't bring them into the IDF.
Yeah.
And Aria, what about on the personal level? Because I've seen things saying that you have women are consistently having fewer children than they really actually want to. Like, what is the effect of these low birth rates on individuals?
So there's an extent to which I'm a little bit skeptical about people's stated number of children they'd want to have. It's unclear to me if they're just like, oh yeah, I would have liked 3, and they were able to have another kid, but they just like, I don't know, the right situation didn't line up. I don't know. If we had more concrete data where it's clear that like we know how many people are like infertile and they want to have kids and they just can't have them, or if like they literally can't afford another child, or like they'll be on the, then like I think that's meaningful. But it's difficult to tell if it's just like, I'd like to have another child if I could afford to send them to private school and have a full-time nanny and it just happened naturally and I didn't have to plan it. It's unclear like to what extent people actually want that extra child. So I think it's like a compelling campaigning line, but I don't know if I think it's actually true.
Many people now seem to think, Aria, that the development of superintelligent AI is something that will happen in the next few years rather than the next few decades. And that could mean millions or billions of digital minds that are superior to human minds able to conduct research for us. It could paradigmatically change things in a way that is difficult to predict, but is very dramatic, and probably means that power will be less about the total number of human bodies than it is now. If something like that were to happen, which, as I say, is considered pretty plausible, would that render this whole discussion we've been having moot?
Yeah, basically, I think so. The part of this that is about economic productivity and whether or not like a country can be a major player on the global stage, that all I think basically becomes irrelevant when you have AI that is much more powerful than human beings. I still philosophically think that I value the human experience, and I think we should have human minds that are conscious in the future. Like, I also probably do think we should have digital minds as well, but I would like humanity to be part of the future, in which case more people probably does mean like more like subjective, like positive experiences. And if we manage to have fully automated luxury communism, I would like there to be lots of human beings who can enjoy it. Yeah,
I mean, so you're not one of these people who would say that actually this is a natural process of evolution, that the AI will supersede us, and that is a good and natural process.
Yeah, I'm sure there are probably like things that could be true about the universe that would make me think that was a good thing, but I actually have no idea what evidence I could possibly have that would compel me to think that that's true.
Okay, so even if we develop superintelligent AI, then pronatalism remains important. And with that in mind, perhaps we could discuss the causes of the falling birth rate. So we've talked about the British birth rates and its ramifications for our future. Let's talk about the reasons. Can we do something that we love to do on this podcast, which is to blame the NIMBYs?
We can definitely blame the NIMBYs a bit. One of the best predictors of birth rates between countries is what proportion of young people move out of their parents' house. So that I think that basically has 3 components to it. One component is how cheap is housing. Another component is what are your youth unemployment rates. And another component is like cultural, basically. And if you can like make housing cheaper, you probably do manage to boost the number of people who are able to form families, basically. I think it's basically just very difficult to get a girlfriend if you're living in your parents' house.
I mean, you say this though, but as you said, there is a lot of cultural elements to it, right? In Africa, in large parts of Africa, it is more common for people to live at home in like large multi-generational families, and they're still having very high birth rates, right? This is a specific, in many ways, like a Western.
Yeah, I'm basically only talking about the rich world here. I think what goes on in poor countries is like very, very different, where people want actually fewer kids than they're having. And I think like good politics there would be to like actually allow people to have fewer children and allow them to have like contraception and allow people to not get married if that's what they want and that kind of thing. So I do think like the situation between like countries that have gone through the demographic transition and countries that haven't yet gone through the demographic transition is very different.
And here in the West, people talk about childcare as well as housing, right? And we have quite restrictive rules about childcare. To what extent does that play a part in the story of falling birth rates?
It feels so intuitively true to me that it must be the case that if you have cheap childcare, you have high birth rates. But as far as I can tell from the OECD data, that doesn't hold up. So it might be that countries with more expensive childcare have other like more pronatal cultures or something like that is going on. But it does actually seem to be the case that we can have really, really expensive childcare and it doesn't seem to have any effect on your birth rate.
Right. So it's not necessarily childcare. It's not wholly the NIMBYs. Could a lowered birth rates be simply something that happens after female emancipation?
I definitely think female emancipation is related to it. It's pretty obvious that like Amish women and like Orthodox Jewish women not live like modern women in many ways. But in the modern world, once like a certain amount of female emancipation has happened, more conservative cultures have lower birth rates than more liberal ones. So like brought up South Korea earlier. South Korea seems to have like an incredibly sexist culture. I think there's a very plausible explanation that what ends up happening is young women like working, they like having friends, and then they meet like their like basically incel male counterparts who think that like if they got a wife that she should like stay at home and basically become like a domestic slave, and women are saying, actually, I don't want that. I think that's also probably a bit true in like Catholic Europe as well.
Well, it's your sort of, you've got the problem from both ends, right? Women have tasted like the joys of work, and the alternative just looks horrific.
Yeah, basically. Like, I think it's very telling that Scandinavia has actually got a reasonably robust birth rate.
And there's some interesting research suggesting that young people in Gen Z, are simply having less sex.
As different representatives here of two different generations.
I'm a millennial. And...
Exactly. Tom as a top shagger, and me as the representative of the chaste and boring Generation Z.
But there's a serious point here. Are young people having less sex? And is that one of the reasons why we're having fewer babies?
I think there's probably a uniform cause of having fewer babies and less sex, but I don't think it's like the actual like causal link. So for example, like a big part, like married people just have way more sex than unmarried people, and like Gen Z are like not getting married as much as like previous cohorts would have at the same age. So the average age at which people get married now is now above 30 in the UK, which basically means that you spend all of your 20s probably not living with a partner that you can have sex with.
But that seems contrary to like what a lot of people think, right? That married people live incredibly boring, chaste lives, whilst the youth are out every Friday night engaging in, gymnastic and acrobatic sex.
I actually think this vision of the world is maybe an example of boomer like supremacy over our culture, where like I think like basically like the boomers were young in the 60s when probably it was the case that they were like having sex and their parents were like much more like buttoned up and repressed than they were. And maybe, I don't know, like maybe they stopped having sex when they were like in their relationships, but our generation just seems to have stopped going out to parties, stopped drinking, stopped doing drugs. I think this might be one of the few cases where phones but too much is actually the answer.
Sorry, say that again.
Where like phones but too much,
right.
I'm just like quoting a meme basically, is like actually the answer, where like people are just like genuinely, they're spending more time like at home on the internet and they're less like incentivized to go out.
But the kind of sex they might have as a consequence of going out, like a casual hookup, that's not necessarily the kind of sex that's going to lead to babies, right? No,
but it does mean you meet a potential partner, right?
Yeah, I think
is that the likeliest place to meet a partner at like Fuzzy Ducks club nights?
I guess, yeah. I have friends who are like now with like long-term partners and like are married and have kids with like people that they met when they were just out to have a good time. Like I've got one friend who met their partner at a gay club, even though they're both straight. I have one friend who met their partner on Tinder after they decided they were going to have a hoe phase. So I guess it happens.
Well, I guess we better head to the nearest Wetherspoons after this, Callum.
Tom, what was that Fuzzy Ducks club that you were talking about? Clearly, that's the place to be.
This was a club in Oxford that, according to some purveyor of totally objective data, like Lad Bible or something, was the fourth easiest pull in Europe.
Well, and if British birth rates are still falling despite the presence of this natural...
Despite the notable pronatalist organisation, Fuzzy Ducks.
We are in real trouble.
Actually, are you familiar with the concept of micromarriages?
No.
So it's like micromorts. Micromorts is a statistical concept where basically you have lots of actions that have like a small probability of killing you. So like if you like drive in a car, that is like a couple of micromorts. Or like if you like take a big plane, that's like fewer micromorts than taking like a smaller plane and stuff like that. And you can like basically conceptualize your life where you have like a certain number of micromorts to spend, and after you spend them all, you'll probably die. And that's like one way that you can think about risk. You can also think about like thought of getting married this way as well. So if you go to a party, you're like spending like a couple of micromarriages, and if you hit like 10,000 micromarriages, you're statistically likely to have gotten married.
I like that this is the sort of 80,000 hours approach to marriage that you just need to grind hard enough, like just a few more swipes, listeners, and you'll find your love match.
Well, if you have a particularly dashing outfit one day, that's another couple of micromarriages.
That's a vast number of micromarriages.
So I basically think that's true. When I'm like an insane person, to be clear, and so when like COVID hit, I was like, okay, after COVID, I am going to find a husband. And I think I decided like what I wanted, and I made like a little spreadsheet where I did like the maths of like how probable it was I would be able to find like someone with my requirements. And then I went on like 80 dates in order to...
I mean, there's so much for me to ask you about this. What were you looking for?
like actually like quite normal things. It's just like I wanted someone who was like within a certain age range, within a certain like potential earning band, a certain set of values. Like when I did the math, I was actually like surprised at how rare, like, so what would be on like someone's normal list if I was going to check it off that I would actually be able to get without like strategically trying to find it. Just like the number of people who like, so for example, I only think probably maybe like 1 in 3 people are like sufficiently moral to actually like treat you well throughout your life compellingly. Maybe that's like a low estimate, maybe that's a high estimate, but I feel like that's like about right, and lots of people would agree that that's about right. If that's the kind of thing you're looking for, you need to like actually spend like several months with someone in order to know if they're a good person. And I think like things like that just mean that you've got to spend like a lot of time dating in order to find someone who's going to make you happy.
And how did you find candidates for this rampant campaign of dating?
Hinge,
okay.
Well, I think there's an interesting thing that you kind of skipped over there is actually probably one of the biggest, micro marriage expenditures there is deciding that you want to get married.
Oh yeah,
right. That for a lot of people who are kind of just dating because everyone else is saying, why don't you have a boyfriend? If you're not actually invested and keen on finding a long-term partner, you're not really, you're actually spending these very inefficiently, your credits very inefficiently.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people probably end up falling into relationships with people that they like spending time with, where if they like really thought about it, they were like, actually, I don't want this person to be like the father of my child. I don't think I could trust them to like support me if I get cancer when I'm like in my 60s or something. But it's like convenient for the time, and then they realize that like, oh God, my entire 20s have gone.
And Aria, for the benefit of all the young men listening to this podcast who are hanging on your every word, was your hunt successful?
Yeah, it was successful. Yeah, I'm engaged.
Oh, congratulations.
Congratulations and commiserations to our listeners.
All right, maybe we can bring this back to your grand unified theory of the falling British birth rates. And you've written about the fact that pregnancy and childbirth can be pretty unpleasant. Is that another factor as well?
Yeah, I think that is a major factor. I suspect there isn't like one form of like impaired fecundity, as statisticians would call it, that I think is like causing it. But I think there are lots of like different micro things that happen. So like loads of people are gay and like comfortable like being in like homosexual relationships. There are loads of people who like otherwise probably would have just like married a person of the opposite sex and had an awful time, but like would have still had a kid, who now have to find like new creative solutions if they do want to have children. So I think that's like a significant portion of the population. Same thing with like rising number of trans people now who are going on hormones that mean they're not going to be naturally fertile. There are we've had a big rise in the number of people having cesarean sections, which means that also puts a damper on the maximum number of kids you can have. And I'm not 100% sure about this one, but there is lots of like floating early data that also implies that there are other causes of decreased fertility that people are experiencing, like maybe endocrine disruptors, maybe like
this is the hormones turning the frogs gay, is it?
Exactly, yeah, exactly that.
Your plastics and microplastics and that kind of thing.
Yeah, microplastics, people consuming too much estrogen. Like, what if we're putting something in the cows that is like making men's sperm counts drop? That kind of thing.
Something in the cows.
Yeah, because we pump cows full of estrogen in order to get them to produce more milk.
Oh, right. So drink organic milk.
Well, that won't. No. It won't, just because organic. Oh, actually, I don't.
Organic might help. Yeah.
But I mean, we're lucky. We're not as bad as the US though in terms of growth hormones, are we? Here in Britain.
I don't think so. But again, like the data on this is like just not clear. It's like, so for example, like we can tell that sperm counts are probably dropping. But we don't know how, you actually only need one good sperm to have a kid. So, like, it's not super clear how correlated that is with other problems.
Well, a sperm less motile now?
That is also one of the things people think might be happening. But, like, really, when I say that, like, there are definitely people who have strong opinions about this, I am not sure the data is yet at a point where I can have, like, a strong opinion about, like, other forms of impaired, like, fertility.
There was the thing, Tom, about how men's testicles are now so full of microplastics that they sort of resemble the ocean.
Well, there's also the discourse about perineum length as well, which
I don't know about this. What's this?
Too spicy for us to touch on. The distance between a man's testicles and anus is, of course, the perineum. And apparently that is correlated with, I don't know, his fertility or his testosterone or something. And what we are finding in Western society is that the gooch length is diminishing. And it seems to be a harbinger of civilizational collapse.
Do we have like any idea why?
Well, no, I don't think anyone knows.
Okay, that's bizarre.
So to bring this all together, the birth rate is falling. we don't really know exactly why, but it's probably multi-causal.
Yeah, that's basically it. I think it would be a mistake to point to one thing and say that's what's causing it. I think it's very, very tempting for especially people on the right to say that it's like some form of like decline in traditional values. But yeah, I just don't think anything points to one thing.
And perhaps we don't need to know the precise causal breakdown for us to talk about solutions, which is what we will do in the second half of this podcast. For now, it's time for a break, or as you might call it, a pregnant pause. Callum, postman's bin. I'm just getting out of the airlock. Oh, there's one for you. Whoosh.
Got it. Oh, look. The Olympus Mons Dogs and Cats Home have asked us to speak to our devoted listeners and ask them if they might open their hearts and find new forever homes for once beloved pets.
Oh yeah? Have they got any good ones?
Well, it says here that one dog in particular is finding it very hard to be placed. Rover is a purebred, Kennel Club certified, Saxavord spit dog who's been with the home for more than 4 years.
4 years? Can't be a very handsome dog. But Callum, what on earth is a Saxavord spit dog?
What on space, you should be asking. In the past, spit dogs were used to turn roasting spits by trotting round in little wheels, like little hamster wheels. Similarly, in the early days of space exploration, the ion engines needed to be kept constantly turning. However, robots were not able to manage the long journeys without wearing out, taking inspiration from the past and being outside the European Trade Federation and its overzealous rules against genetic modification. This species of dog powered the first wave of British space colonisation.
Anything else we should know about the Saxavord spit dog?
Well, it says here that if you can't house him, and that is reasonable given that he weighs 80 kilos, just £4 a month will help buy treats and little booties for his 80 cute little paws.
I am sure Rover's plight will open hearts and wallets across the galaxy. And we're back. In the second half of this podcast, we are going to talk about potential solutions to the falling British birth rate. And I'm going to hand over to our resident trad influencer, Callum.
Well, yes, as a man, Aria, who dreams of setting up his own little bungalow in the countryside with roses growing over the door and retiring some of the thatch from the KC3 and building my own little home away from home, I, of course, believe that the problems with birth rate are solely the result of degeneracy and the collapse of traditional values. Would you say that all we need to do is go back to barefooted women who are sort of kept at home and pumping out children?
So if you look within countries, people with more conservative politics do have more children, but it definitely seems like overall, if you're in a more conservative society, you'll have fewer kids. I would guess that a little bit more conservatism on some axes would help. So like having like a culture that is elevates mothers over like single working women probably would make a difference. I think a big part of the reason some women will delay having kids is because being like single and free is like really, really great. And actually, I think we like marginalize mothers a lot in our like public life because I guess they're much less likely to work, they're much less likely to consume like goods and services, and so therefore they're not as targeted. But on the flip side, I think if that conservatism comes through a kind of like male chauvinist lens, I think it can be like quite unproductive because I don't think women like really want to become like domestic servants. And I don't think women really, like when they're thinking about what they want their lives to be about, I don't think they also want it to necessarily be exclusively at the service of children as well. So I think like still like having a big life outside of the home, I think should become like a big part of any prenatal culture.
Well, yeah, and I've definitely read things that say that actually one of the strongest predictors for whether a society, whether you have like a high birth rate, is whether the women and men in your country think that a child is harmed if the mother goes out to work. Because in that case, you've got this sort of joint conservatism of you must be having children, but also, you know, you can't go out, you have to totally give up your life. I was also going to ask whether you think that there's a sort of cultural bias against mothers because there's a sense that they have maybe sort of betrayed the sisterhood or kind of gone against a set of values that maybe they want to have children but are not like promoted.
I think there is like probably a subset of society that you could say this about. But I think for the most part, I've done a lot of work on like female founders and women in work in general. And like people's like assumption still is that like a woman will probably like most of the time want to have a child. And that in order to have like good female liberation, like we also need workplaces to support mothers. So like I think while there is probably like some niche part of like feminism that is like anti having children, I don't think it's like the mainstream kind that most people are experiencing.
And I'd be interested in what you think about what explains the rise of these sort of so-called trad wives who are promoting a vision of femininity that seems like quite at odds with a lot of the current trends and beliefs going on in like most Western countries.
Your gingham dresses, your raw milk, your kind of willow baskets full of produce.
Yeah, and it seems like they are promoting a form of natalism that maybe isn't happening elsewhere.
Yeah, I guess they are like somewhat pronatalist, although I would probably stress that they also emphasize that having children involves a lot of work in a way that I think can be unproductive to people who like want their lives to have something other than children in them as well. That being said, I definitely think there is a kind of like sexy, like fashionable appeal about it that I think probably might make some people like want to have more kids. Like I definitely think there's like something appealing like about returning to the countryside and spending more time with nature and spending more time forming meaningful relationships. I think people on the left and right are both interested in. And then I think there is also like an aspect of the male gaze that obviously like influencers like will be pandering to like people who find them attractive in many cases.
You think in this case it is that you are appealing to actually a male desire for this, and these women are largely meeting like a male urge or a male want?
Maybe. I actually maybe think there is something like slightly more like psychologically weird going on, where it is they're appealing to the female gaze, but they're appealing to the female gaze of being desired by men. So I suspect that like I mostly find that men are like not that interested in what women wear and like what kind of like aesthetic they have, and like, but I think women like think a lot about what men want, and therefore like I think there is a version of this where you're like, if I was like more like this, boys would like me more because this is the kind of thing I think boys might like.
But I mean, of course, and I think you've talked about this, that actually as like women's clothing becomes like skimpy and it's like becomes socially acceptable to show more skin, or more of your like body, it has allowed some women to like capitalize on this, right?
Yeah, so I think there is like almost like a defection against womanhood that you do when you're trying to become like sexier. So like I think makeup is a really good example of this, but I also think like sexy dressing is an example of this, where like ideally I think as a woman I would never have to wear makeup. I would never really have to think that much about what I wear, except in terms of like how artistically gratifying it is, rather than how much people like would think I'm attractive with what I'm wearing. But if like some people start to like try and make themselves more attractive, then there is going to be like a drive for everyone to do it a bit in order to maintain their like positional advantage. I think with people getting like, without having like strong modesty norms where people are encouraged to cover up, what ends up happening is it's way easier to be like sexy and high status if you're younger, basically. And you can definitely, I think this is like somewhat overstated, but you can definitely forego some sexiness by getting pregnant and having kids, because like your body will change quite a lot. So therefore there might be like...
Well, you've also, you've given up 9 months, right? And then you're like older, so you've given up a period of sexiness.
That is true. Yeah, so therefore, like, if you have like immodest dressing, then you allow like single young sexy women to like gain positional advantage over mothers, basically, of the same age. And so therefore, like, that might be like some indication why like traditional cultures have had modesty norms, because cultures with modesty norms have had high birth rates.
And I think there are a lot of people who are worried about these falling birth rates and are actually starting to come up with ways that actually this can be challenged. They're saying, my values, and these are liberal Western values, are like demographically on the decline. What can we do to fix these? And what do you think of the Collinses and their model? And maybe you give listeners as well a little recap on who they are and what they believe.
Yeah, so I guess my summary of Simone and Malcolm Collins is that they identify as secular Calvinists. So they've come up with their own like family culture that is based on Calvinist culture, which I think you would think of as like Puritan culture, like American settler Puritans. And they want to come up with a way that they can find this culture that has like high pronatal values and then pass that on to their kids. So their kids also have loads of kids. And so their kids' kids have loads of kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Until like, I think their prediction is, I can't remember the precise numbers on this, but if they have 7 kids for each generation, within like, I think 7 generations, they become like the majority global population.
The law of compounding numbers, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think this is interesting. Like, I kind of hope they succeed. I think it would be nice if in a world that's full of like Amish people and Orthodox Jews, there is also like a technophilic, secular Puritan culture alongside of it.
But because this is what they argue, right? That we need to have children so that support for liberalism, for LGBT values, for like other what we think of as key Western ideas continue rather than being like erased.
Which is why they're calling their children things like Industry, Americus, and Titan Invictus.
Yeah, they believe quite strongly in normative determinism, I believe. So, yeah, I guess that's what they've decided to do.
And I think like this to us seems kind of ridiculous and very classically American. Is there a model of this that might work in Britain? Because at the moment, the model we've accepted in Britain is we will have a below replacement rate, fertility rate. We will have immigrants come in to make up those numbers. A lot of these immigrants then tend to adopt, in many cases, like the countrywide fertility. So actually, you've almost got a Ponzi scheme on the other end where you're just adding, again, generations that will have fewer children and just increase the size of that dependency ratio that's coming down the line towards us.
Yeah, so I definitely think there are things that we can do to have a more pronatal culture. I think it would be difficult to do without politicians kind of being explicit that they wanted this. So this is like, we're years and years behind this, I think, happening. The example that I think is quite a good example, Collins is very interesting, but the example that of like a country doing this is Georgia. I think people slightly overstate the Georgia case because Georgia managed to take their birth rate from below replacement to above replacement, and that feels like quite striking, but it's like not that much because they weren't that far below replacement at the time. But basically what they did was they've got like a particularly niche kind of Christianity. So they got their like archbishop to bless and become the godfather of every third born child in a family. So like this was at a point where like Georgia's average like number of like the median household had 2 kids. And so they had a remarkable increase in the number of families having a third kid, because for practices of that form of Christianity, that was like a really fun, interesting example. The counter claim against this is actually this was going through a time where Georgia's economy was doing really well. So actually, like people often, when they feel rich, will have more children than they were originally planning on having. So maybe that was what was going on. But the counter argument against that is that the Georgian Orthodox Christian birth rate rose faster than their other minorities. So it probably did work a bit.
But this is a problem, right? Because Britain is becoming, well, secular. It is a secular country, largely. Officially, we are still Christian. And actually, Islam is growing as a proportion, so it's probably not fair to say that we are becoming more secular. But we can't rely on these kind of techniques and gimmicks in order to raise these birth rates. What does a British pronatalist policy look like?
You say that. I think our royals are to some extent a pronatalist force. Like, forget about Meghan and Harry, who I guess I think said that they were only going to have 2 for something the environment. Will and Kate had a lot of kids. Like a lot for a British couple anyway. I would hope that like had some kind of inspiring value. That meant like people love Kate Middleton. I also think that influencers do seem to have like a fair number of children as well. I think because like once they can afford it, this is actually a form of conspicuous consumption that people can aspire to a little bit. So I don't think it's impossible to find cultural figures who are like British and appeal to British people that can like model what having a happy family looks like. I think if we were going to think about this on a policy level, you could probably think about ways of like making like larger families look more normal. Because I think like basically everything in British culture kind of tells you that you're a bit abnormal if you have 3 kids. Like for example, like car seat rules assume that you actually only want 2 kids. Otherwise you're going to have to get like a weirdly big car. I find that like food is packaged for families of 4, like pretty much all the time. Like I think people kind of think it's aberrant to have 1 and they kind of think it's aberrant to have 3.
As a child of 4, who grew up with a vast, great bus, it is definitely a change in what's normal.
Yeah, it's a big signifier that you're like somehow an outlier. I read a good piece in The Spectator actually about a guy who has 3 kids, and basically like everyone like in his like kids' birthday parties and like his kids' schools like think that they have like a right to comment on this, and they're like, oh god, I don't think I could do it with 3, and he's like, it's actually none of your business.
But a lot of this is cultural, right? Is what you're saying that actually. It doesn't really matter how many, what the ratio between nursery like supervisors and number of children is. A lot of this is like fringe and marginal stuff. What you really need is a culture that values children and is excited about perpetuating itself and like having children to do that, right?
I think you need everything, basically. Yeah. I think like there are like so many different ways that people decide to make family planning decisions. And I think a pronatal culture helps, but I also think like prenatal, like actual like economic policies also would help. And I don't think we haven't really had a country that has really managed to reverse demographic decline, but I would be surprised if doing one of these things was enough to change things.
Well, there was the French example. You see this where Macron said, in the face of falling birth rates, he's decided personally to step in. So, which I thought was described as the most French headline. So maybe an example, Tom, where we actually have to follow
Rishi Sunak will step in.
Rishi Sunak, top shagger, has to go forth, get on his bike and
knocking on the door of every childless couple.
Hello, I've come for your vote. And God, a horrible image. I think another thing, Aria, that is maybe causing, I'd be interested to know what you think, is that particularly in the Anglosphere, there is this idea that children need a vast amount of resources. I know that the Collinses have said, we have taken various sacrifices. We're not going to send our children to fancy schools and we're not going to go on holidays. Is there a world that, like, in order to raise birth rates, we have to basically accept children can just be left alone to run around outside and you don't need to spend money on them?
Yeah, basically, I think that would be the most prenatal meme that we could seed throughout the culture. As far as I can tell, this is my like personal pet. If I had like one universal theory of why birth rates are falling across the world, this would be it. Because I think it explains the inter-country data as well as the within-country data. And it's that if you believe that you need to invest a lot of time and energy and resources into your child in order to give them a good life, this like massively decreases the number of kids you have. I think like one of the good correlates that shows you inter-country birth rates is how much homework do children usually do. So I think if like children do loads of homework, you kind of think maybe they need tutors, their early years education like really, really matters and need to be heavily invested in, then like having a young child is just so much more work. South Korea has like some of the most exhausting schooling that I have like heard of throughout the world, where kids like will go to like cramming schools like all through their school life in order to like get into one of the top universities. And this like whether or not you get into one of these top universities actually really does have a big impact on your social standing the rest of your life. And I think we've seen like an ever increasing amount of like investment that you're meant to do into your child in like Britain. So like when I was younger, I think it was like much more normal to leave children alone at home. Whereas I've now heard that like the situations that I was left in when I was 10, where I was like alone, my mum told me not to like open the door if like someone knocked on the door, but then she would like go out, and that was how I spent my summer holidays. That is, I think, now illegal to do. Childminders are actually experiencing like much more regulation than they did when we were kids. I think it was quite normal when we were younger to just get like dropped off at like some random old lady's house, and that random old lady like had kids. Your mum probably knew her. She seemed fine. Whereas now that's like illegal and you need to go through a lot of offset regulation. Like you cannot be a childminder unless you keep like a diary of all the food that's like in your building and that you have to record like food incidents, that kind of thing. Like that is just like one tiny aspect of this. But this is also true in that you're meant to be watching like the motor skills of a child and like what kind of speech they're developing. Like the paperwork involved with just taking care of a child has like gone up massively. And I think we have basically seen this trend continue in our country and other countries like us. And I think that would explain why having children seems to be getting like much more exhausting. Like the really telling stat now is that actually parents spend way more time with their kids than they ever have before, despite the fact that like women are much more likely to work outside the home. The one country that's been quite resistant to this is France. Like French nurseries have like don't have like particularly like rigorous ratios, so you have like way more kids per like nursery minder. The French spend way less time with their kids than usual, and the French seem to have like a basically like what we consider in like England like a negligent attitude towards their kids, and like they've got the highest birth rate in Europe.
But does this mean that the French kids are stupider and more prone to accidents and don't turn out as well?
Tom, we don't need an expert on the podcast to be able to answer that question.
The French seem fine.
And what about the outcomes in this country? I suppose the underlying assumption with this safetyism is that the kid will be better off if they have more of this kind of attention, be it in the form of overzealous childcare or like many hours of homework, all that kind of thing that adds up to it being very time consuming and resource intensive to bring up a kid. Are these underlying assumptions actually correct?
I think the evidence just isn't there either way. So like, I think people like do lots of hand wringing, for example, about whether it's better to be at home with your own parent or go to nursery. As far as I can tell, it doesn't really make much of a difference unless you're like on the extreme, like unless you're like in an extreme situation at home, basically. There almost definitely are certain things you can do that will like increase your child's life outcomes. So I don't want to say that like parents should basically be negligent. I'm sure there is like good stuff. And also you can like build a society that means that it is like easier to leave your kid alone as well. So if we had safer streets, safer roads, if we had more like low traffic neighborhoods, for example, controversially, then probably parents would be happier leaving their kids to play in the street. If you have a school system that doesn't provide like nearly as much homework and that like basically delays a whole bunch of testing until kids are like much older and can like self-motivate, then that would probably be pronatal. But if like it's really important to pass the 11 plus to get into a good grammar school, to get into a good like university, then yeah, parenting probably will be much more exhausting.
Well, this is a question that I want to ask, because you're right, it's easy to have this meme of let's all just be super chill, but it just takes one cheater who could then, by doing not that much of extra work, gives their child a better, better conditions, and then there is it's the double income trap, right? If everyone is doing it, you're the Red Queen. You have to run as fast as you can to stay still.
Yeah. So yeah, I think like you need to set the right incentives for something like this.
Well, Aria, then our listeners will be hoping for the privileged position of asking you, when they have their vast broods of Anglo-futurist offspring, how can they give them the best head start in life?
Honestly, I don't know. Like, a big part of the problem with research in this area is that conscientiousness is a great trait to have. It like basically means that you're going to do like much better in your life. And conscientious parents usually create conscientious children for like both like genetic and parenting reasons. And they're also much more likely to follow like any random like meme that tells you that like if you do this, it will be good for your kid. So therefore it's actually like really, really difficult to tell, like even like on the level of like whether or not drinking alcohol in pregnancy is bad or like how bad. It's like really difficult to tell, because once the idea that drinking alcohol in pregnancy is bad for you comes out, conscientious parents will do it.
The ones who will probably have children that turn out well, kind of like regardless of the memes.
Yeah. So it's really difficult to tell like the size of like any of these effects and like how strong they are. If I had to like pick like the top couple of things that you could do that I think there's reasonably good evidence for, is if you're in America, keep your kid away from lead. They still have lead in their water pipes and they're like wall paint. That seems like a no-brainer. In Britain, probably don't drink when you're pregnant. That's like probably one. I disagree with Emily Oster on this one. Try and have kids younger. They'll probably be better.
I thought there was the argument, though, that if you were older, you have more resources, so you can then put more time and things into your children.
Yes, so you will be richer, and being richer is better. But I think that's more predictive rather than helpful. So that like you are more likely to be conscientious if you're the kind of person who has kids later, because you're the kind of person who has like gone through like education, like a degree, several degrees, has also done their grad scheme after that, and has worked very hard in your career, and like you will probably pass that on to your kids. But if you are like in an economic position to have children, you will probably have slightly healthier children if you have them when you're younger.
There's an interesting kind of negative feedback here, or well, I suppose it's a positive feedback, in the sense that your conscientious parents are the ones who are reading this advice and probably finding it most sort of nerve-wracking and following these and being worried about this stuff.
Oh yeah.
Which is actually like reducing their birth rates, when actually probably most of them will be like fine regardless of what they do.
Yeah, basically. Although it's like have you ever like told an anxious person that they should just calm down? Like, I don't think there's anything you can do about this.
Yeah, interesting.
Seems like the trick is to find a conscientious partner, and that's the most important factor. You have to find the right person.
Yeah, and a conscientious partner is one of the greatest predictors of your lifetime happiness.
As Aria has proven to us, they are found on Hinge. So get swiping, all of you.
Aria, you've explained to us a number of potential cultural and political fixes which sound wonderful but might be tricky to enact all at once. This begs the question, is there a single technological innovation, perhaps one that you've written before in Works in Progress in your essay on artificial wombs, which might solve this problem?
Yes. Okay, so artificial wombs, they are a way of growing a full baby outside of the human body. They don't yet exist, but we have like sort of almost artificial womb-like technology that we have given to animals but not to human beings. So you can grow a mouse embryo outside of a mouse body for about half of the full gestation period. Maybe you could grow it for the full gestation period, but currently that's not legal in basically like any country where they have advanced life sciences, because there's an overall commitment to not grow embryos for more than 21 days. We've also got technology that are basically womb-like environments that we put lamb fetuses in, that are like basically like incubators on steroids. There is like a couple of weeks in the middle of the gestation period that we like don't know about yet, but like basically like it seems like we probably could potentially cover the entire period.
These are surmountable problems, you're saying?
Plausibly surmountable. I'm not like 100%, because like there are loads of unknown unknowns. We don't know everything about pregnancy. And therefore there is probably like a whole bunch of stuff that like maybe you could grow the creature, but then it would be like it would have like loads and loads of health problems that we don't know about yet. But there are projects to see if we can do it with the woolly mammoth. So maybe we'll then see what we can do with humans.
I would like to know what these artificial wombs are like. Like, are they vats with like amniotic fluid and an umbilical cord that's pumping in nutrients?
Yeah, they kind of look basically what you'd expect them to look like. So the big thing is that like fetuses don't breathe air. They're like fully submerged in fluid that is like really, really highly oxygenated. So once you start to have like a lung-like structure, you need to like pump it full of like oxygen in order to get it to work. After that, you also need like a cocktail of like nutrients that the fetus is getting, and also probably like a whole bunch of like hormones and other stuff that we're not sure about yet.
And the attraction of artificial wombs is that they solve a bunch of problems, right?
Yeah, there are loads and loads of people who want to have kids who don't have like a working womb in their relationship. Gay couples, really obvious example of this. But also, like, as I mentioned before, the number of C-sections is on the rise. There are loads and loads of people who I assume would like want to have another kid, but like are really afraid of like tearing their like cesarean stitching, or they've had like a really difficult birth experience. They're not like, maybe some people almost die when they go through it, and like are potentially like worried that like, what if they take like their existing child parent away from them, and therefore like are scared of like having like another child naturally.
Well, and I think there's a lot of stigma, right, in Britain, where people say, oh, too posh to push. Yeah. Like, oh, you're wrong to have a cesarean section, but you know, giving birth is dangerous, and cesarean section can be safer, but then, as you say, it limits your total number of children that you can have. Yeah,
like, to be clear, I'm not like anti C-section at all. My mum used to be actually like a gynecologist, and she moved from working in India to working in the UK. When I was like a little kid, we lived in Shropshire, where the NHS trust there was like Shrewsbury and Telford, and they have like now come out with a bunch of data that shows that they were basically like negligent in terms of their like care. But at the time, my mum like was like, oh, this is what gynecology in the UK is like. This is inhuman. She thought it was like incredibly dangerous because they were pushing natural births onto the women. I could think it was like basically an ideological move that took place within this like particular practice, where they were like, actually, like, it's much better to give birth naturally, but they were like recklessly endangering women's lives. If you look at the current NHS stats, a really, really high proportion of our entire like obstetrics and gynecology budget is spent on paying people back for this kind of movement. So like, I am not like at all anti like C-section. It's like a third of the budget or something ridiculous.
Well, and there are these arguments about sort of immunity, that you supposedly have children have better immunity if they give naturally. But actually, I've seen stuff that basically says, you know, this can be remedied pretty easily. Yeah. And again, this feels just part of the ideological project, right?
Yeah. Also, like, would you risk your life to give your child like slightly better immunity? Probably not. They're probably way better off with an alive mother.
I know, I totally agree with that. And as we've said, it's an astonishingly bit of kit because they solve a lot of these problems. Like what they allow mothers to potentially delay having children, so that fix infertility problems like that.
Yeah, you could have. So yeah, it basically means that you can be way more innovative with when you want to have kids. Like currently, we're basically completely biologically constrained with the fact that you have to have children at some point, if you want to have them, between the age of like 16 and 35. 35 to like 45 were like pretty healthy during that period, and people are already taking fertility treatments that increase their odds of being able to have kids like during that period of their lives. We could just take this further.
Is there a worry about like egg and sperm quality at this age?
Yes, I would probably want to pair mainstream artificial wombs with also universal gamete freezing for people to do. I think, yeah, insofar as I had to pick like one pronatalist policy that was like reasonably cheap to push, I probably would push like universal free egg freezing, because I think there's probably like a large proportion of people who will want to use their eggs like a couple of decades later, but will not have already frozen them, and then we'll be working with like not nearly like as good of a supply later.
It seems like there might be a good potential dovetailing here with polygenic embryo screening. Perhaps you could tell listeners what that is and how that might fit with the idea of artificial wombs.
Yeah, so polygenetic, I think risk screening is what it's called, but I'm not 100% on that actually, is when you are like going to have IVF. And so normally what they do is they'll like fertilize loads of embryos and then just like randomly implant a couple. With polygenetic risk screening, you just implant the ones that seem to have the best DNA. So this is like not that uncommon if you've got like a really bad genetic disease to do, where you'll like screen out the ones that have like problems and then you'll implant the good ones. Some people think that you should also use it to test for like a whole bunch of other stuff. So you can like potentially see which genes are associated with having a higher IQ, with having a lower cancer risk, with having like better mental health. And then like they pick the embryos that are most likely to do that instead.
Well, and they go further, don't they? You can do sex selection, and that's become common, particularly in sort of India and China, hasn't it?
I think sex selection in India and China is not really polygenetic risk screening, but is instead abortion.
Okay, so it's abortion-based rather than, okay.
Yeah, because like polygenetic risk screening is like expensive and basically not done anywhere. It's like quite uncommon. As far as I can tell, the people who have it done have friends who like know. Like it's like quite like an underground thing, I think.
And obviously this raises the problem that if you have a population that is consistently improving quality of its DNA, and I suppose that is even a loaded term, right? Because many people would argue that you can't do this, that it is wrong to put traits on a sort of hierarchy or a spectrum with one positive and one negative end. What is the criticisms that people have towards the use of these techniques?
So I guess like one big criticism, which is like worth weighting, is that it's not actually that effective or exciting, because you're like picking from a set of like embryos that you would already have. Like there's not that much leeway you can get like a bit of stuff, like
sure, but surely if you're drawing from the top of a distribution and that like accumulates over a few generations,
so you can get a couple of benefits, but I would caution that like the benefits over a couple of generations probably wear off. Like if basically what you're doing is you're getting the best possible kid that you can have for your genes, that kid is then it's like still basically carrying that. So like if you can get like 2 IQ points boosted, they're probably performing at like the natural maximum of your DNA. Like I think you pretty quickly butt up against the fact that like some people just don't have like genius genes.
And as we've said, you've written an essay on the topic of artificial wombs, and one imagined that the trads were roused from their homesteads and they flung their raw milk on the floor in rage at this idea. What kind of feedback did you get?
Honestly, like almost exclusively positive. Maybe even in terms of like the internet, exclusively positive. I guess I'd already blocked lots of the kinds of people who would have hated it on the internet already. One person, I would say, wrote what I would describe as a fan fiction about me being pregnant that felt hostile, but actually, I guess, was friendly.
Yikes.
It was mostly fine. Yeah, I think people quite liked the piece. I think partly because, so my initial pitch was we should cure pregnancy. And the piece was written with that idea. And then it got edited to what I would say is probably a more reasonable position, but maybe not like my actual opinion.
I know there is definitely people who, when they hear this, they worry about the idea that you effectively get a speciation event where humanity breaks somewhere along class lines and you have wealthy people who are able to improve their children, have designer babies, which leads to effectively a split between the intelligent and the rest. How would you argue these people?
So I think like one thing to note about polygenetic risk screening is that it's actually more helpful the lower your IQ is for like your kids. If IQ is the measure you're like measuring, but basically like less like genetically healthy you are, the more gain that you can have. If you're already basically like a rich person who's like top of your game, you're probably like performing like almost at like the max that like human DNA as it currently can do for you. Whereas like if you are like more ill, basically like lower end of like the genetic spectrum, the more it can gain for you. Also, we already have like quite a lot of assortative mating.
Assortative mating being where?
Assortative mating where like highly educated, intelligent people have kids with each other, and then like poorer people have kids with each other.
Which has led around the world to problems where you get like far less social mobility, right?
I actually don't know if it's led to these problems. I think that you can like probably look at like lots of economic factors as well that have led to this, or like I think potentially like the opioid crisis in America has disproportionately fallen on some people, and that is probably like maybe a better explanation for lack of social mobility than assortative mating. I basically think like there's enough randomness in this world still that mostly like things are still just like very in flux.
Well, and class hierarchies haven't been embedded for very long in the grand evolutionary scheme of history, right? A few generations is nothing.
Yeah, and if you like look at like millionaires and billionaires, that money is also like lost quite quickly over several generations. I think that's like a ridiculous stat of like the like American like industry like trust busting era like titans, like of their like great grandchildren, none of them are like millionaires.
Although there is the counterexample, right, about the Russian gulags, where the towns that Russian intellectuals were sent now have far higher productivity because their children were raised there and then outperformed the people in the village over that is like functionally the same except for the presence of these people.
Yeah, I mean, that could be true. I don't want to like say that like genes mean nothing and that like if you are like intelligent, hyper-educated person, you're like disproportionately likely to have an intelligent kid. Just that like the extreme ends of the distribution are like extreme basically, and that most people are like making like marriage and like kid having decisions based on like loads and loads of factors, and that like speciation is probably more likely to be happening on like a looks matching level than on an intelligent matching level.
Or as in attractive people marry attractive people, and then right, because that's far more biological and actually
that's probably the way most people are making these decisions.
Yeah, interesting.
And back to artificial wombs, Aria, how close are we to being able to use and deploy this technology?
I think there's a good chance we'll never have this technology, basically. I think like the technology aspect of it seems like it could be solvable, and there are people that I've spoken to who think we're only like 30 years away or something. But if you're going to make them, you need to at some point do like a clinical trial on like a whole bunch of babies, and something will probably go wrong. And that in order to run this clinical trial on like, I don't know, like a statistically representative sample of children, you're going to have to make like a lot of children who like probably suffer quite a lot. They end up with like disabilities that we couldn't have predicted, loads and loads of issues. I can't imagine like which kind of country is going to legalize a big experiment like this. I can't imagine which parents are going to let their kids be grown in like the first experimental artificial wombs. And not to say that it's impossible, just to say that like a lot has to change about the world before I expect that we're going to have like artificial wombs for human beings. I actually think it's much more likely we'll have them for animals.
Yeah, animals first, perhaps. Well, let's imagine that they become adopted. If they were legal and safe, how, in your view, should Britain embrace the technology? Like a chicken in every pot and an artificial womb in every married couple's bedroom?
Oh, yeah. No, I think like if I could wave a magic wand and say that we could get rid of all of the possible like tech trouble in order to get this technology, I'd be like, no one should ever be pregnant again. It seems like it would be like refusing to get vaccinated. Like pregnancy is like really, really hard on people's bodies. I think it's like it represents like a major sacrifice that parents make. Like it's like one of many sacrifices that parents make, but it is like a major sacrifice that they make, that like you put your body through that and like you go through like that kind of pain when giving birth, and that you're like, yeah, I think it would be great if we could forego that and have children born without it.
And today we have people who prefer to give birth at home, incurring some risk for mother and baby, but they do so because I suppose it feels intuitively better because it's more natural. Perhaps one day we might live in a world where the equivalent might be giving birth naturally, whereas the majority will be using artificial wombs.
Yeah, like I think there are, like, despite the fact like so artificial wombs, so pregnancy is clearly like a little bit bad for your health in lots of ways. Not universally, obviously, but like lots of people struggle with it. I think also it's likely that lots of people eat very badly. I assume that like there is like an optimal nutrient balance that like a growing baby could have that is different from what like a reasonable person is going to necessarily eat. I think we could get to a position where like having a baby naturally would be less good in terms of like the health of the child and the mother than growing them in an artificial womb. At that point, I think like only like a couple of like traditionalists would probably continue to do it naturally. And like I wouldn't want to stop them, but I wouldn't want to encourage them either.
Well, and there's quite promising opportunities here for like female emancipation, right? That a lot of, I've seen charts saying that a lot of the difference between men and women now, like career-wise, can be explained by like the motherhood penalty. That actually it's having to take time off when your body is like recovering, and like then caring for a child in early years can explain a lot of this, of like difference of outcomes.
Yes, although I think the motherhood penalty is more about early years childcare than it is about pregnancy. Like obviously pregnancy is like not nothing, and like maternity leave is also not nothing. But I think it's more like who does this school run by default?
But it shifts the emphasis, right? If it's not the person who's carried the child right then and there, then you know a couple has a child together, and that changes the question of like how work is distributed.
I think it would like change a lot of like default presumptions that people have.
Well, maybe we can even work out how many artificial wombs there might one day be in this country if we think about the number of children born per year.
Yeah, it's about 700,000.
So we could extrapolate this and perhaps imagine that one day there'll be 1 million artificial wombs in this country,
churning out good young Britons.
2 million if we solve the pronatalist crisis.
3 million if we colonise the moon.
The mind boggles.
And what's next for your work on pronatalism?
Yeah, so I was asked this in like a recent article that I did in the Times as well. I feel like a bad pronatalist compared to Simone and Malcolm Collins. Like I probably will have children, but I'll have children and I'll make the decision for like the normal reasons most people do. Like how much money do I have? Like how easy was giving birth? How easy is my first kid? And I like think about this issue like quite similarly to like the way I think about climate change, where I could be the kind of person who like washes all of her plastic and like never like I guess never uses single-use plastic and like never flies and that kind of thing. But I like mostly think this is an issue of like systems and economics and culture, and not really an issue of like individual action. And therefore, like I don't want to be like, in order to be a good pronatalist, you have to have at least 4 children.
But what you've talked about that actually a lot of this is a cultural need. We need cultural memes of big families being a positive thing, to be more omnipresent in our society. Like what is the big event of the year, the big influencer, the big celebrity, the big whatever that gets us all broody enough to start popping out children?
So I think we need visibility for people who have kids. I think people need to normalize the idea of having like a big family. So I think one idea, we could like copy Georgia. We could maybe give like medals or let you like get like a kind of like Duke of Edinburgh award for every 3rd kid that you have or something, where like, you know, you meet Prince Charles, you shake his hand, maybe he becomes the godfather of your child, something like that. I think that would appeal to some people. We could also do something like, we could imitate like Pride Month maybe and have like Baby Month. So apparently people are way more likely to have kids if they see lots of pictures of kids. I think just like everyone like finds them like kind of cute maybe. So maybe we should have like, you know,
but I am going to press you. Yeah. Who is the person in Britain who, you know, is it David Attenborough having
I think it might be a bit late for him
having more children? Is it Rod Stewart? Is it Rishi Sunak? Like who is the person having more children who would really shift the dial on this stuff?
I'm so out of touch. Like the only celebrity I can actually name is Taylor Swift. Now I think about it.
Well, I'm given what the era
this will be a huge event for American fertility if she starts having children.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe that is actually
I actually on the Taylor Swift pronatalist angle, I don't actually necessarily think maybe if she like has a child it'll make that much of a difference. But if you are a close listener of her most recent album, The Tortured Poet Department, the amount that she like seems to like really, really want kids is striking. And it's I think she talks about it in a way that most women her age would be embarrassed to admit how much they wanted it. And I think maybe there is something to the Taylor Swift like being like yearning really, really strongly for marriage and kids that is like maybe like slightly helpful and corrective in culture. Because I think a lot of people find it very cringe to admit that that's what they want.
What is she saying on this album then?
Oh God, if you're going to get me to start quoting Taylor Swift lyrics. So basically, can I think of, she has like a lot of lines that are like, you put a ring on my like ring finger and it made my heart explode. She has a line about how like they were going to be pushing cradles like any day. Like it's that, like there is a whole bunch of that kind of thing. They talk about like sitting on children's swings. Like there's a lot. So basically, the full context of the album is that she was in a 6-year-long relationship with, as far as I could tell, a man who like didn't commit. She wanted him to propose and he didn't. Then she had this like several-month love affair with Matty Healy of the 1975, who, as far as I can tell, promised her he was going to marry her. They were going to have kids, and then ghosted her one day. And so the album is about like
rotter,
how painful that whole experience was. She has like one song called The Prophecy where she's like, oh my God, am I never gonna like have real love? Am I never gonna have kids? And there are loads of songs that are like genuinely just like really, really sad when you look at it through the lens of the fact that this is what she really wanted and yet she hasn't managed to get it yet.
But there is a happy ending for Taylor Swift.
Maybe.
Well, we don't know yet. But
we don't know.
Well, she's met this glorious beefy quarterback.
He's not a quarterback.
Is he a quarterback? Sorry. What is he? Like a tight head prop equivalent?
My hunch is, as a person who is intimately aware with her psychology, that it's not going to last.
You heard it first on the Anglofuturism podcast.
Like, he's just not her type.
Well,
bit late now.
Unfortunately for her and for the good of humanity, she might need to marry him and start having children.
I will let you go shortly, but where can listeners stay apprised of your writing? How can they keep up to date with you?
Okay, I am the only person on planet Earth with the name Aria Babu. So if you Google me, my Substack and my Twitter should come up.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I think Callum and I have heard enough. As we speak, Callum is texting his girlfriend an invitation to the KC3. And I myself am texting the British Space Agency to beseech them for separate sleeping quarters.
And soundproofing, I hope.
And soundproofing.
As for you listeners, go forth and get your leg over. Do it for king and country.
Aria, we wish you the best of luck with your pro-natalist campaigning. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Goodbye.